I was going to do slaughter removal.
Yeah, that's fine with me.
You can do tower
Because
2.
I'm just not up enough on IEPA,
That's fine.
even though it's very interesting.
If y'all could start sitting down, a couple of y'all who are up, and we can get started. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you all for coming today. My name is Nicole Alvarez. I'm the president of the Tulane Law Federalist Society, and I'm so excited to have you all here tonight. In 1933, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt asked the FTC Commissioner William Humphrey, a President Hoover appointee, to resign from office 5 years before his term expired. FDR didn't offer specific reasons, and Humphrey declined to resign, so FDR simply fired him. In 1935, the Supreme Court held in Humphrey's executor that when Congress creates a multi-member, nonpartisan commission whose functions are largely legislative or quasi-judicial in nature, the president may not remove an appointed member simply at will, but only for cause. That decision anchored decades of doctrine respecting the independence of agencies such as the FTC. But now we stand at a moment of serious institutional tension and potential change. The Supreme Court this term has granted review of a few cases that squarely raise the question, will Humphrey's executor survive in its current form, or will it be substantially narrowed or even overruled? So to discuss this topic, we have two outstanding constitutional law experts, Professors Josh Blackman and Stephen Griffin. Professor Blackman is a national thought leader on constitutional law and the United States Supreme Court. Professor Blackman's work was quoted during 2 presidential impeachment trials.
Back to back.
He has testified before Congress and advises federal and state lawmakers. Professor Blackman regularly appears.
Brian Fry, my friend, you're here. Now I'm happy. My days are made.
He regularly appears on TV, including NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox, and the BBC, and is a frequent guest on NPR and other syndicated radio programs. He has published commentaries in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and leading national publications. And since 2012, Professor Blackman has served as a professor at the South Texas College of Law in Houston. He holds the Centennial Chair of Constitutional Law. And Professor Blackman is the senior editor of the Heritage Guide to the Constitutions, the third edition, and has written more than 7 dozen law review articles that have been cited more than 1,000 times. Professor Blackman was selected as the Jurist of the Year by the Texas Journal of Law and Public Policy, received the inaugural Meese Originalism Award from the Heritage Foundation, and was awarded the inaugural Joseph Story Award from the Federalist Society. He was selected by Forbes magazine's 30 Under 30 in Law and Policy, and Professor Blackman is the president of the Harlan Institute, founded Fantasy SCOTUS, the internet's premier Supreme Court fantasy league.
Should all play.
He blogs at The Vault Conspiracy and his Twitter is at Josh M. Blackman. Professor Griffin teaches constitutional law here at Tulane Law School and is interested in constitutional theory and history. Over the course of his career, he has emphasized the key role of constitutional change in American constitutionalism, including the role of formal and informal amendments and the Constitution outside the courts. Professor Griffin is the author of 3 books, American Constitutionalism from Theory to Politics, Long Wars in the Constitution, and Broken Trust, Dysfunctional Government and Constitutional Reform. He has co-edited a reader on constitutional theory, Arguments and Perspectives. His writings include more than 50 articles, book chapters, book reviews, and short contributions that have been cited in political science and history journals, as well as law reviews. As a personal, shameless plug, his article, How to Make the Debate Great, a reassessment of originalism versus living constitutionalism, will be published in volume 100 of the Tulane Law Review.
Does that make debate great again or just great?
Just great.
Oh.
I avoided the again.
He mentions it in a footnote if you read the article.
Oh.
He received the Sumter Marx Award for his scholarship in 2000 and the Felix Frankfurter Distinguished Teaching Award, the law school's highest teaching award, for the classes of 2002 and 2022. He was the law school's vice dean of academic affairs in 2001 to 2004, and again in 2006 and 2009, an interim dean in 2009 to 2010. Before being hired at Tulane in 1989, Professor Griffin was a Bigelow Fellow at the University of Chicago Law School and research instructor in law for 2 years at NYU School of Law. So thank you both so much and welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. The topic today is about the unitary executive and in particular the president's power over removal. So did you all pick up a Constitution? If you didn't, go grab one, but I'll cheat if you don't. So the Constitution begins, Article 2, Section 1. I love this. He's getting one, good. The executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States of America. It doesn't say much more than that. If you go to Article 2, Section 2, it says, the President has the power to appoint officers of the United States with the consent of Congress. I'm shortening it a bit. All right, so the president has this executive power. The president can appoint certain officers with consent of Congress. And then it says in Article 2, Section 3, the president shall take care the laws be faithfully executed. There's 3 clauses we're talking about here. The vesting clause, the executive power is vested in the president. The appointments clause gives the president the power to appoint. And the take care clause, the president must faithfully execute the law. There's something missing here that's not in the text of the Constitution. There is no express power over removal in the Constitution. It's mentioned nowhere. So how do we understand the issue of whether the president has the power to remove? So my brief time today, I want to talk about a few periods in time. The first is 1789, a very important year for this republic. The second is 1865. And the third is 1926. Okay, let's go through those 3 periods. The first one is 1789. What happened then? This is when the very first Congress met, right? The very first Congress assembled. And they had an important job. They had to create the various departments. The Department of State, Department of Treasury, Department of War, not defense, war. And they had to then decide who are the officers who would be in those departments. So you have the Secretary of the Treasury, who was, Alexander Hamilton. You have the Attorney General, Edmund Randolph, and so on. But the framers, many of them were in the first Congress, had a decision to make. We know the president must appoint with the consent of the Senate, but how do you go about dealing with termination? So the framers debated this for nearly 5 days in the House of Representatives. And they went back and forth. Originally, the text read that the officer can be removed by the president. Okay. Later, the text was modified again that said these officers can be removed by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate. So you have these 2 visions on display. So there were 2 schools of thought. One school of thought is the power to appoint includes a power to remove. Okay. But then the question is, who has the power to appoint? Some people said the president appoints with the consent of the Senate. Therefore, they're both involved in the appointment process. Therefore, they both have to agree on removing. Okay, that's school A. School B says, no. The president appoints. Sure, the Senate gives their consent, but the president makes the appointment. And the president can then decide whether to remove. This was debated back and forth in the House. I can read you the quotes. I won't bore you with them. Ultimately, the bill didn't really address the removal power. They sort of left it to inference, one might say. And the bill passes the House, and it goes to the Senate. The Senate at the time, unfortunately, didn't record their debate, so we don't really know what was said in the Senate. What we do know is that the Senate divided. I think the vote was 10-10. And what happens when the Senate divides in a bill? The vice president breaks the vote. And what did John Adams, our first vice president, vote? He supported the bill. And that bill did not limit the president's removal power, just sort of ignored it. And then George Washington signed it. This debate is known as the decision of 1789. And we've been discussing this decision for over 200 years. What did they intend? What did they mean? The consensus view, and the one view that I hold, is that the debate means that Congress cannot limit the removal power. And you don't have to sort of take my word for it. You can look at Joseph Story. How did Joseph Story describe the decision of 1789? He said, the sense of the first Congress was that the removal power could not be abridged by the legislature. This is what Joseph Story read. James Madison said the same in correspondences. Chancellor Kent said the same. Almost everyone who spoke of the decision of 1789 understood it as saying the president's power can't be limited. Now, I want to be fair. There are scholars today, Julian Mortensen, Jet Sugarman, and others, who contend vigorously and passionately that we are wrong about the decision of 1789, that this majority was actually saying that, yes, you can limit the president's removal power. Okay, I want to be fair to our debaters. The next period of time I want to talk about is 1865. This was a wild time. The Civil War had just come to a close. President Lincoln had been assassinated. And Andrew Johnson, a Southerner from Tennessee, was elevated to the presidency. While Lincoln was a vigorous proponent of Reconstruction, Johnson was not. Yet you can imagine Johnson's dilemma. He comes into office, and all of his cabinet members were Lincoln appointees, including the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. Now, President Johnson wanted to fire Stanton. He wanted his own guy in charge of the War Department. But Congress had passed a law called the Tenure of Office Act. And what did this law say? That to fire the Secretary of War, the president must seek the consent of the Senate. The Senate must consent to this. Johnson and the Senate were at loggerheads. In fact, they were about to impeach him and remove the guy from office. So the Senate was not going to consent to this. So what happened? Johnson fired Stanton anyway. This was a remarkable story. Stanton locked himself in his office. I'm not joking. This actually happened. He said, I'm in my office. I am not coming out. You want to fire me? Come and get me, basically, right? This went on for some time, and eventually they worked out a political compromise where Stanton left. But the Republicans in the House, the so-called radical Republicans, impeached President Johnson. And what were the charges of impeachment? One of them, that he violated the Tenure of Office Act. The Tenure of Office Act said you must seek the consent of the Congress before you fire the Secretary of War, and Johnson did not seek that consent. Therefore, they argued this was an impeachable offense. As history records, Johnson was impeached in the House, and it went to the Senate. Did they still read Profiles in Courage? I don't even know. One of the famous books of the 1960s by JFK, maybe it was 50s actually, called Profiles in Courage. The vote to convict Johnson failed by one vote. One vote shy of removing the president. It's a fun story. Had Johnson been removed, the Senate President pro tem would become president. So basically the guy leading the impeachment wants to be president. Crazy time. So what does that mean? Those trying to impeach Johnson took the first view that you could limit the president's removal power. President Johnson, like perhaps Vice President Adams and James Madison, thought, no, you cannot eliminate removal power. So there wasn't really a clear resolution. This didn't go to the courts, right? And I think it was in the courts back then. Johnson was acquitted. Now I want to fast forward to the year of 1926 with the case of Myers against the United States. Who was Myers? He was a postmaster. You may think, oh, what's the big deal, postmaster? In the 1920s, this was a very big position. A lot of patronage, for sure. A lot of money involved, but power. The mail was power. We didn't have the internet, didn't have phones. This is how information was conveyed. So what happened? The president comes to office and he decides to fire this postmaster, Myers. But the statute again said you can only fire this postmaster with the consent of the Senate. Case goes to the Supreme Court. Who writes the majority opinion? William Howard Taft, the Chief Justice. Now, many of you probably know this. Taft was the president. He, more than any other president probably ever who became a justice, knew about executive power. He understood it. And he said, the limit cannot exist. And he said the removal power is part of the executive power. Why? The president must take care that the laws are faithfully executed. And how can the president faithfully execute the laws when someone he disagrees with is executing the laws? That if the president wants to ensure the laws are executed, he must have his own people in office. He can remove them by himself. Justice Brandeis dissented in the Myers case. He said, I've read the take care clause. There's nothing about removal there. Congress creates these offices. The Senate consents to people being appointed. Why shouldn't the Senate have a role in the removal? So at least in 1926, it seemed that Taft settled the issue. But then, as Nicole graciously mentioned a few moments ago, about a decade later, we get to the New Deal. And you probably all studied the year 1937. This is the so-called switch in time when the Supreme Court said, all right, we'll go along with your agenda, Roosevelt. We're not going to fight anymore. But in 1934 and 1935, there was still sort of resistance between the court and the Roosevelt administration. President Roosevelt told William Humphreys, a member of the Federal Trade Commission, I'd like for you to step down. Adios, farewell. And Humphrey said, no way. All right. The case goes to the court. Interestingly enough, Humphrey dies. That's why it's called Humphrey's executor. The executor is litigating the case. Funny, true story. Once in class, I made a joke. I said, I bet Roosevelt had Humphrey killed, right? Just mostly as a joke. A student who was watching my YouTube lectures found the death certificate. He was not murdered. It was a coronary. So we could put that rumor to rest. You're welcome. Humphreys, in many regards, was a repudiation of Myers. It's sort of hard to line those cases up. Maybe this was simply a reflection that the court was saying, we don't want Roosevelt having all this power. We're going to push back. But the reasoning in Humphreys was very strange. They said that the FTC was not really an executive agency. They had this weird phrase, quasi-legislative, quasi-judicial. It's got a little bit from column A, a little bit from column B, a little bit of country, a little bit of rock and roll, right? It's just sort of this weird hybrid. And even if the president has power over the executive branch, he does not have the power over the FTC. All right. But later cases expanded for even purely executive agencies like the FCC, the NLRB, the EOC, go down the list. All these executive agencies were now subject to these removal protections. You can only fire them if you show abuse, neglect, or some sort of a malfeasance in office. For, I don't know, about a century, conservatives have said, we need to overrule Humphrey's executor. This case has got to go. They tried many times, but now we're at the precipice that it's likely going to be overruled. President Trump came to office and he said, you're fired, and you're fired, and you're fired. He fired all these members of independent commissions, and the court will soon decide a case called Slaughter. Oh, man, what a badass name. Slaughter versus Trump, or is it Trump versus Slaughter? Some case names really fit, like Brown or Loving. Like, the case name helps you remind what the case is about. Slaughter. Couldn't have made this up. That's why he fired her in particular. Don't underestimate Trump. The arc to Trump soon, right? And the court here argues in this about a month or so. And the U.S. government, the Solicitor General, has basically said overrule Humphrey's executor using the Dobbs framework that said this case was egregiously wrong. It's not proof workable. It's been eroded over time. All the stare decisis factors cut the other way. The court more or less signaled that they're going to overrule Humphrey in a case called Boyle and Wilcox, these sort of emergency docket orders. They said, well, Trump, you can fire them for now. We'll decide later. I think I realize I'm out of time. Nicole's getting a little antsy. I'll stop here. I'll let go. So I think this is going to be a case where the court, if not overrules Humphrey, guts it of any significance. And I don't think anyone will be surprised by this. The upshot is these so-called independent agencies, and I use these scare quotes quite liberally, is that they won't exist anymore. Whenever a new president comes to town, he'll simply appoint all members of the board, and these agencies will just be an extension of the president. The tricky one, though, is the Fed. The Federal Reserve. In a decision a few months ago, the court basically said, FTC, yeah, you can probably fire, but the Fed's different. Oh, the Fed's different. And I think the court is afraid that if the president affects monetary policy, the interest rates and otherwise, it creates these cataclysmic effects. Is the Fed actually different? I don't know. Maybe. I mean, Aditya Bamzai and other people have made distinctions, maybe. But I think the court will have to sort of grapple with that. But Humphrey's executor is not long for this world. Mr. Humphrey, will not have died in vain. All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Mr. Griffin. I look forward to your remarks.
Okay, well, I'm glad you're timekeeping, right? I reread Nicole's email, and it did say something about predicting the outcome of Trump versus Slaughter. So I guess I'll start there and cycle back. Since Josh started more like in the 18th century, maybe I'll reverse.
Good.
And I do anticipate that Trump versus Slaughter will be the end of Humphrey's executor. It'll be viewed as a fundamentally flawed decision. But this is quite a remarkable turnaround. This is really some story. And there's an intervening case that I don't think Josh mentioned.
I didn't. Yeah, you're right.
Called Morrison versus Olson.
All right, I did not.
And there's a pretty astute observer of executive branch behavior at Georgetown, Marty Lederman, who made the point that look, if you're really reasoning technically, Humphrey's executor hasn't been the lead case in removals for quite a while because it's questionable rationale, as Josh said, relying on this somewhat weird idea of quasi-legislative, quasi-judicial, was in effect lifted out of the opinion and replaced whole by a new rationale and a new rule in Morrison. So you could make a good argument that Morrison is the real lead case, but that's not why I'm emphasizing it. Because Morrison was 8-1, right? Scalia advocates the unitary executive position. He doesn't really take on the full removal. What he's kind of obsessed with in that case is that a prosecutorial function is an executive function. But here's a story about where a case from Morrison is like 1988. You go from 8-1 to now there's going to be a wholesale revision, whether the court concentrates on Humphrey's executor or Morrison. It's been quite a campaign. I was picking up signs of this in the late 90s in a relatively minor case, I think called Edmonds, where there were a number of people trying to say the court's now on a path to repudiate Morrison. In other words, they were so eager to support Scalia's point of view that they were looking for any angle into the opinion. And I'm not telling you this to tell you this like this is bad. I'm just saying this is a remarkable story. You go from 8-1 to a mainstay of the administrative state being in danger. I mean, that's news. And it shows you the power of persistent advocacy over time. And maybe also that Morrison was simply reflecting the views already extant in the people who had been serving in the Reagan and Bush administrations, people like John Roberts and Alito. They were either maybe already of this point of view, I haven't seen any research on that, or they were willing to be convinced. And many people thought Scalia had written one of his most masterful dissents. And it wore pretty well. It also tracked into the unitary executive is of course a broader debate than just removals. But the fact that he stood for the unitary executive, it's kind of a remarkable story. Now, going back in time, we have the twins, Myers and Humphrey's executor. How would I alter Josh's story a little there? The way I read the law review commentary is a little different. What I see is the law review commentary through the years before we get to this period of advocacy and we're going to change things, is that no one was really happy with either opinion. And Myers, many people thought, including people on the Supreme Court, that Taft had gone too far. He wanted deliberately to write a sweeping opinion that would establish not only that things like the Tenure of Office Act were unconstitutional, he wanted to establish a general rule across all offices in the executive branch. And so his opinion had this sweeping quality, but as many people have noted, it's even in the case book I've used, it was hard to tell whether the arguments he was using were in fact grounded in some kind of past constitutional decision or judgment, like the decision of 1789, or whether he was making policy decisions and saying, look, as a matter of constitutional policy, if you like, this is the best way to run the presidency. People have to be responsible to the president. That could be true, and it could also be true that nobody in the 18th century made that decision one way or the other. The other thing that gets a little off focus is if he's arguing for a power of removal in the president, what's the opposite position? The opposite position is not, and really couldn't be, that we're opposing Congress trying to encroach and claim the power of removal. That's not what at issue at all. And Humphrey's executor, at the very least, was very clear on this point in the last paragraph. Even if you think the whole opinion is mush, the last paragraph was perfectly clear in saying that we're actually not really talking about removal. We're talking about Congress's power to condition certain offices, not all offices. We're talking about their power to condition certain offices so that the president cannot simply dismiss at will. And that at least raises the idea that we're talking about a subset of the executive branch, not the whole branch. So Congress, in that vein, is hard to see them as being aggressive. And Taft clearly worried about this. And he thought, like many people do, I certainly bought this in law school, that the Tenure of Office Act was wrong, unconstitutional. And I believe Taft was correct to say all presidents subsequent to Andrew Johnson objected to it. And it's eventually repealed. And so if it was repealed, why is he still worried about it? But it was a very salient example. There's no doubt about it. So Taft's sweeping opinion is probably one of the reasons why the Supreme Court kind of did a mirror image of rejection, but it didn't reject, you see, all the idea that the president could remove some offices. It carved out a space for Congress. And let's remember, if we're talking about the 18th century, that Congress is solely responsible for creating the entire executive branch, including every last person who, say, works at the White House, other than the president and the vice president. And if you want to talk about it that way, they can also abolish all of those executive agencies. I realize that's not our problem now. But the necessary and proper clause is the magic lever here. You notice Josh didn't talk about Article 1. But that's the true opposition here, not between removal or appointment and what the Senate's role is, but the role of Congress as a whole in constituting the executive branch, and sometimes putting conditions on offices. That should lead us to ask, why would they ever do that? Especially if you're in love with Taft's policy reasons. But all of that is maybe not even relevant to figuring out the constitutional design. The other thing that struck me about Myers eventually is that, look, some of the smartest people ever to serve on the Supreme Court were in dissent. If Taft was the president, he really knew all about executive power from a presidential perspective. Why didn't people like Brandeis and Holmes go along? What did they know? Well, Brandeis, and there's a pile of evidence to support this, he knew that the 19th century in general didn't go along with whatever Justice Story said, that there had been actually multiple Supreme Court cases and plenty of precedent, what the Supreme Court now calls history and tradition, on the side of Congress having a role, not in removal, but of structuring offices in a certain way. And here we get to another big problem that Taft never solved. Implicitly, this discussion is often always about principal officers and the president's control over his cabinet, and everyone nods their head and says, well, the president, has to have control over their cabinet. But a sufficiently sweeping principle, like Taft liked, would also mean that the president would have control over everybody, not just principal officers, but all the inferior officers. That makes it really hard to explain how the civil service, which had developed over a series of decisions in the 19th century, was compatible with the idea of the president just being able to reach out and vaporize someone. in the civil service. Taft never addressed and never thought he had to address the inferior officer issue. But it was relatively clear to the courts in the 19th century that the Constitution literally said that Congress could create an office and then make someone other than the president solely responsible for their removal, which was also inconsistent with Taft's super broad idea. So you arguably have two opinions. Both of them are overwritten and go too broadly. The problem is, as far as precedent, that it was Humphrey's executor rather than Myers that was reaffirmed more than once. It was reaffirmed in a case called Weiner in the 1950s, and then it got reaffirmed in Morrison. So if, okay, sorry. So if, in the words of a major podcast, stare decisis is for suckers, and then there's nothing to worry about. We can ignore all this, but it's not just Myers versus Humphrey's. Humphrey's executor was the lead opinion, and this was recognized repeatedly by majorities on the Supreme Court. Now, how do you get into a situation where there's a campaign against this? You know, it's really hard to argue that President Reagan didn't get his way, even with respect to independent commissions. What you have to keep in mind is all presidents get appointments to these independent commissions, and people in DC know the way the wind blows, so they all get influence right away. So the policy impulse behind this is hard to discern, but there's no doubt that people took up the Scalia banner. And finally, so if this gets back to the decision of 1789, what would I say about that? Now, I noticed Josh said that, you know, that this was the framers. Okay, there's some of them, but it isn't actually the same group. And I think we have to play fair and have the same methodology across different issues. And so it really matters that initially we have no decision on this from either the Philadelphia Convention or the ratifying conventions. We have no useful information. That points in the direction not of, you know, it's right or wrong, Taft is right or wrong. It points in the direction of what many scholars have urged, which is there isn't enough evidence from the 18th century to do the work that Taft and Scalia wanted. You're talking about what can be, in terms of scope. I mean, Josh didn't fully define the doctrine that Taft was interested in. But if Taft was expressing an interest in having a super broad doctrine, the evidence just isn't there. It just isn't there. Part of the problem is, in their fullest flower, the independent regulatory agencies didn't exist in the 18th century. There were some efforts to create subordinate agencies that don't resemble the unitary executive picture, and people are arguing about that. And I've told my class they can look at a debate on this exact question between Michael McConnell and Christine Shabbat that's up on the National Constitution Center. It's a very nice debate back and forth because it illustrates this point, because it's all about the 18th century. And it's all about examples and counterexamples. And my general take is, I don't see a need to come down one way or another on that historical evidence. Why? Because in the debate, that historical evidence is in service of a super broad assertion. So you're talking about a super broad assertion of presidential power, which is based on a slender reed. There's going to be another article illustrating the historical problems of the unitary executive theory to come out in the Yale Law Journal really soon.